What is up, y'all? Kevin Kuhn here from Athlete Factors. This is the Athlete Factors podcast. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Fry. How are you today?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this and dropping some knowledge on everybody who's watching and listening today. So, you are a professor at Kansas University. Tell us a little bit about all the stuff that you do there, if you will.
Well, I've been here now for 13 years, and before that I spent 13 years at the University of Memphis. Came here in 2007, and when I first came, I came as a department chair and did a term as that, and then I stepped back into just a professor's role and back into the lab. And during my time here, we've had an opportunity to interact very nicely with various parts of our athletic department, and which has become a strong focus of what we do. And in recent years, we've developed a portion of our lab called the Jayhawk Athletic Performance Lab, which is focused on sport performance. So health, fitness, youth, aging, so forth, those are good topics, but the focus of this part of our lab is how do we optimize sport performance. So that has been fun. We interact with local high schools, individual athletes, and certainly some of the coaches and teams here at the University of Kansas. We're not part of the athletic department, so that's good and bad. It gives us a lot of autonomy. On the other hand, there's no coach or team or anyone that's required to interact with us. And it has, for a number of years, complemented well with other parts of my research, where I've had one fork of my research has been at the molecular and cellular level, as well as endocrine. And then we have the performance side of things, and they complement each other. But I'm moving more and more towards the performance side because it's easy to get spread out a little bit too thin.
For sure. That's awesome. Yeah, there's not too many programs that actually have that, let's say, foot in the trench, even though, you can look at kinesiology programs, exercise physiology programs all over, and you can get a degree that has an emphasis in strength and conditioning and in athletic performance, but there's rarely a program that actually has that emphasis or even a place to do research specifically on that, like your performance lab. So that's pretty unique. That's pretty cool stuff.
You bring up an interesting point, and it really resonates for me because there are many programs that have sport in their name. And for example, our department is a good example. We're the Department of Health, Sport, and Exercise Sciences. And there's a lot of programs that say we do sports medicine, sports science, sport performance. And you have to kind of look closely, okay, so what exactly do they mean? Because is it really focused on optimizing performances in sport, or is it for general health and fitness, which is what probably most people do? And if you ever get a chance to hear, there's several individuals that give really great talks on this. So one of them is Dr. Mike Stone, one is Dr. Bill Sands, who worked at the Olympic Training Center for many years, and there's others as well, but where they really differentiate, okay, what exactly are we talking about, and what's the difference? Because exercise science is not identical to sports science, and there's a lot of overlap, but there is a difference, and I think in some circles that's underappreciated.
Yeah, after finishing up my master's at Baylor, I went and worked with a professional running club in Indianapolis, and while I was there, I was like, all right, I gotta go back to school. I just don't know enough yet. I gotta get my PhD, and my number one choice was at ETSU with the Stones, and I was actually accepted, but there was some funding issues, and I didn't get to do that. But yeah, the Stones they're legit when it comes to actually focusing that aspect of education on performance, on the actual sport science and actual sport performance. So that's,
if you or any of your listeners get a chance to, in December, they always have a conference, and it's not a huge conference. If you go, you can meet anyone you want, and interact with anyone you want, and pick their brains and whatever. But it is very focused, and it's a fun. It's one of my favorite conferences to go to.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I'll have to make a note of that and try to get out there once traveling and conferences are back up and running. So the reason that we're having this conversation today is really because a friend of mine and former student of yours, Mandy Para, said, Kevin, you've got to talk to this guy about really about how to improve the quality of research and improve people's skill at reading and understanding research. So we'll kind of get into that a little bit deeper. But before we do, can you tell us a little bit about just your personal background, your academic background, your athletic background? You mentioned a little bit of the academic side a little bit, but if you'll just dig into all of those a little bit more, that would be great.
Well, the sport that's my first passion over the years, although I'm not involved with it anymore, is wrestling. So in high school, I loved track. I wasn't very good, but we had so much fun with track. I was fortunate to have a great coach that really made what could easily be just a bunch of individuals out there all doing our own thing. There was a lot of team cohesion and unity and support, even between the throwers and the distance runners and the sprinters. And I mean, so that was fun. But once high school was done, that was the end of my career there. But wrestling was a passion of mine. So I was able to wrestle in college and a little bit afterwards. And when I graduated from college, also, I was fortunate enough. It was a great example of, where you do your internship. It ended up being my first job. And it was working at what was back then called a health club. But it was a private commercial fitness center, and I managed it for a few years, and then I purchased it. And so I was, an entrepreneur, small business owner. It was before the term personal training was even invented. It was during the time when aerobic dance was big, and one of my biggest blunders from a business side is I started an aerobic dance program and rented a big hall for that, and it was going like gangbusters. And I decided, I'm really into the strength training. This just doesn't float my boat. And so I kind of folded it. And that was about how much thought went into it. And, later I'm like, that was a stupid business mistake. But my education, I did my undergraduate in physical education at Nebraska Wesleyan, and I did my master's at University of Nebraska and my PhD at Penn State. But those educational experiences were fantastic. But working in private industry, where your paycheck depends on interacting with clients and providing a service, and we really focused on serious lifters. We sponsored powerlifting teams and weightlifting teams, and put on bodybuilding competitions. We put on wrestling tournaments. We had, so it was that kind of a clientele, and you learn so much because you can read about it in a book, but let's put a program together that's going to peak you for, a competition. Okay, now that's where the rubber meets the road. And, like we were talking about earlier when we were talking about track, when it comes to the conference championship, I better have put all the pieces of my training program together. And, track is a great example of that, where, people understand what periodization is and how to bring a person to a peak, and does it always work the way you want it? No, obviously not. But working in that setting was huge, and you can't read or you can't just read about it. And then when I sold my health club and went back to school, and at the same time I was working at the national headquarters for the NSCA, and that was right when they were really going through a tremendous growth. During that time, this was mid to late '80s, and that was one of the most fun jobs I ever had, because I was kind of a jack of all trades there, and but I got to meet people that one was the person I ended up doing my PhD with, Bill Kramer, and so I ended up being his first doctoral student. But going through working with him, doing a 2-year postdoc at Ohio University with Bob Starren, who was an excellent muscle physiologist, and even though he worked at a medical school and a physical therapy school, he understood resistance exercise and studied what's going on at the molecular and cellular level, and so that was invaluable too. So it's kind of interesting. It wasn't a big grand plan, but it worked out well, where each step kind of took me to where I needed to be, and so after that I went to University of Memphis. That's where I met my wife, who's Mary, a sports psychologist, and we've been off to the races ever since.
That's pretty awesome. Yeah. You mentioned Bill Kramer. That's, for those in the know in the industry, that's like royalty, basically. So,
well, he's he gave me some advice. I guess I don't share this with anyone, but it's not a secret or anything. Several years before I went to study with him, I met him. And he was not at University of Connecticut at the time. He was working with the U.S. Army. But he knew I was looking at programs, and he said, well, for sure, find someone that will take you under their wing. And he said, because there's a lot of places you can go. But find somebody that will take you under their wing. And he wasn't like recruiting me because he didn't have a program. But I think it was about 1.5 years later, he did have a program. And so then I had not found a good fit. And I'd say that was my experience. Very demanding, very high energy, which is very challenging. But I think that's part of the process, and very challenging intellectually too. And but you go back and it's like, he still takes care of this. He's an old coach. In fact, I'll back up a little bit. My senior year in college, he was coach at Carroll University in Wisconsin, and we were at the same tournament. And we didn't realize that for a long time. And later we compared notes, and it's like, I was there, and I didn't compete against this guy, and which would have been interesting because he had a pretty good wrestler at the same weight class. So probably just as well that we didn't knock heads. But we crossed paths years before. So
that's awesome. Yeah, you never know when those overlapping timelines occur. Like that's funny. It's a small world at the end of the day. So awesome. Well, that gives us some nice context for kind of where we'll go to next in the conversation. So as I mentioned previously, my friend Mandy says you've got a really solid handle of pointing out issues with research methods or design, or ways to make things set things up so that the answer that you get is actually the answer to the question that you think you're asking when it comes to research. So with all that being said, can you give us just like what's the basic goal? What's the reason behind controlling the research method? Like there's so much that gets published, let's say, by mainstream media. Like it every few years we get this shift in, like eggs, for example. There was this study that was published in, I don't know, New York Times or Wall Street Journal or something like that, saying eggs are just as bad as smoking cigarettes, and is based off this review or who knows, because nobody takes the time to actually look into that. So when it comes to things like that, like how can the average strength coach or sport coach or just layperson, how can we understand the research method better?
Well, that's a great question, and you can write a book on it. In fact, there are books on it, and I'll throw out some thoughts. Some of these are things I've seen and observed or experienced. Lots of times it's mistakes or errors I've made or been involved with, and some of it's my opinion. And I'll try to identify or be forthcoming if it's just my opinion, where it's not necessarily I have data or anything on it. But we talked about this, and this will resonate with anyone who's been in like a grad level research design class. What is the research question? So someone says, I want to do a study on how this training program in the weight room is going to enhance my 3K steeplechase performance. Okay. So I'm going to, the question is, maybe they come to you and say, hey, I want to study steeplechasers. Okay. What about them? Well, I don't know. Let's see. It's like, what is your question? And because there could be a billion of them, all of which could be very good. But what is the question that you're asking? And is it theory based? So I think maybe if we did, use an example I threw out there, a certain type of training in the weight room might be beneficial for the steeplechase. All right. What's that based on? Well, there is some research out there that maybe is related. Okay, so there's something to support this. I'm not just making a guess. It's not just a blind shooting in the dark kind of thing, but it's theory based. And quite often I'll see people that will, and this happens a lot with grad students. An example from my experience was I had a student that said, I want to study lactate. Well, I knew where they were coming from because we had just bought a lactate analyzer. They wanted to turn it on and run it. And it's like, well, what about lactate? Well, I don't know, but I want to run some samples through that analyzer. It's like, well, there's a lot of good stuff that we could do. Let's back up a little bit. Just because you have a technology or just because you have access to some data or a certain population, it's like, okay, but what is the question that you're trying to answer? So on one hand, that sounds very simple, but lots of good research should start there. Now, on the flip side, in the world of sport, I'm going to say something that flies in the face of that. Because sometimes maybe, say you invite me to come work with your track team. And I say, okay, so you've got all their training logs, you've got their performances, maybe you have their weight room programs or anything else. You have their injury histories, you have nutritional records. I don't know, you have all kinds of info. And someone comes in and says, well, let's do some data mining, or let's look at, what do we see here? Is there anything that's of interest? And so it's sort of a fishing expedition sometimes. And that's a little bit controversial because one school of thought is you need to register your study and this is it. And these are your stats and these are your variables and do not veer from it. And there's a good argument for that. On the other hand, in the world of sport, sometimes, and not just sport, a lot of discoveries are made. Oh, I wasn't looking for that. Look what we found. And I think sports is a good example where sometimes, what do we see out here? Is there a pattern? And there's statistical tools you can use legitimately to see, is there some helpful information? Maybe not. Maybe it's not helpful at all. Okay. But the classic model is you do have a research question and you're going to try to, answer it. You very seldom come up with the answer. You come up with more questions, but you chip away at it.
Yeah, I think that whole idea for most lay people is, and even for strength coaches, personal trainers, what have you, it can be really, really either discouraging or confusing because from from one perspective, it's like, well, research proves things. Conduct research, but like in grad school, that was kind of a huge shock for me, was understanding like, no, it's not really proving anything. It's providing evidence for something, but there's no definitive proof one way or the other that, this will do this. There's just evidence that you can mount a case for. It's kind of like a court case, right? Like sometimes there's actual proof, and then sometimes there's just evidence, and then so you've got to figure out the difference between the two. And
yeah, and I think maybe to put it in perspective, you're quite often people will look at say in the pharmaceutical industry.
Mm-hmm.
I'm coming up with a new medicine. Well, now we're talking about health and fitness and maybe life and death situations. I better be extremely confident that this medicine is going to do what we think it will.
Mm-hmm.
And so the statistical analyses are tight. And how confident do you want to be? I want to be so confident in many cases. And so that dictates controlling the study, that dictates how confident are you on 99% or higher confident. Let's go to the sports setting. So let's say you're the head football coach somewhere, and coaches do this all the time. It's Saturday, big game day. I've got my game plan here. I've scouted my opponents. I know what kind of defense they like to run. It's third down and long, and quite often they'll say, okay, given this setting, how confident does that coach need to be to call that one play? He doesn't need to be 90. In fact, they're never going to be 99% confident.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to guess if they're 60% confident, I'm on that play for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how forgiving and how exact does it need to be? Well, it depends on what your analysis is and what your purpose is. And so a lot of people kind of lose track of it. They want precise, and yes, lots of times you do need it so that you have accurate data. In the sports world, sometimes you don't have the always have that luxury. Kind of depends what your question is.
For sure. So how can errors in controlling research result in incorrect conclusions, incorrect applications, or just what you think you're getting when it comes to a result is not actually what's actually taking place?
Well, there's a couple things. There's a lot of things that can contribute to that. Misinterpreting or misunderstanding research. And very seldom is the result, and you alluded to this, very seldom is the result of research black and white. Yes, this works. No, it doesn't. Yes, I take this supplement and I will come in first. But that it's not that simple. And so sort of like you were telling me earlier, you're very interested in looking at movement deficiencies and contributions to injuries and so forth. Well, what contributes to an injury? Well, if I fell in a hole and broke my leg, I can tell you that hole was the problem. But in sports, that's not typically what happens. Mm-hmm. And I guess it can be, but it's much more complex than that. Mm-hmm. And so I'm trying to find the thing or the test or the thing that, yep, this is it. And sometimes it might be right, but it's so multifactorial. But one thing I tell my students, when you look at sport-related research, well, research in general, but if it's dealing with exercise or training, and I tell my students, you may have a lot to learn in the physiology side, endocrine, biomechanics. You may have a lot to learn in some of these other sciences. But one thing you should know inside and out is exercise and training and programming. So look at what what was the training that was done, or the type of a test that was used. But so much of the time, people will look at, I want to compare this kind of training with this kind of training, whether it's a training periodization versus non-periodization, or block versus linear, or free weights versus machines, or isokinetic, or high velocity, low velocity, high volume, so forth. I'll come up with a program over here, and I'll come up with a program over here, and we'll see what the stats say. Oh, this one came out ahead. Well, go back and take a look at the training program, because you can and you should go back and see, well, was that even a good training program that was put together? Mm-hmm. So yeah, one group came out ahead of the other, the way the study was designed, but are you comparing the right program? Mm-hmm. And plus, as you know, you could spend a whole session on just the training programs and how it varies. Well, there's literally a million ways to put it together, and you're picking one over here and one over here. Mm-hmm. Okay. And you're saying this is representative. Okay. But look at the training program and decide, is this even a good program? And it's easy to get in the literature and see, well, we did 3 sets of 10 leg extension. So that applies to all resistance exercise? Well, probably not. Is that appropriate for that study? Yes, but can I extrapolate that to everything else? So I mean, put your thinking cap on, because you know exercise. And it's just as if you had a client come up to you and they said, I'd like you to start training me. It's like, fine. What have you been doing? Bring me your training log. Show me what you've done. And you can look at it and make some judgments. Say, okay, it might be a problem here. Because I mean, that's what we train our students to do, and that's what people in our profession should know. So, and that's where I go back to where I was saying earlier, when I've worked with college and high school and junior high and youth leagues. I've coached people at national level, national competitions, and so forth. That is extremely helpful, because you're in the trenches. You've done it. Everyone thinks they can coach. Everybody thinks they can coach. Mm-hmm. But you find that it's another thing to actually do it. Just like everyone thinks they can be an official. I think every coach in every sport should spend a year being an official for their sport. Might change their attitude. But yeah, understanding what the exercise stimulus is, and because you get people that really don't. They may have a good research question, but they don't really understand what the stimulus needs to be. And I think that's underappreciated. Yeah. If you and I were working together and I wanted to study distance runners, okay, I'd need to get on board with someone. The good news is that Kansas, our distance coach, has a PhD in exercise physiology. Oh, great. But I'm getting Dr. Whittlesey on board because he's the one that knows that sport inside and out. And he'd be able to tell me, okay, that's not even a good training program, or that's not real. People don't even do this. Mm-hmm. That's one thing that I think is missing on both sides. The people that read it, but also among some people that do the research.
Yeah, I remember a few times in grad school where, I think it was in neuromuscular exercise physiology class with Dr. Willoughby, and he would say, all right, let's take a look at this study. And, it's examining the differences between this type of training modality and this type of training modality. And they're looking at, this specific outcome. And based off the author's conclusions, they recommend that this is the better option. And everybody's just like, okay, cool. And then he's like, no, just kidding. Let's actually look at these training programs and you tell me what the issues are with this. And then we actually look, and, you're comparing these two things, and it's like, these people had never the people who set up these groups are like, they've never trained before, because no one, like you said, no one would ever do that. And you're comparing that against something that's like, yeah, maybe somebody would do that if they got it they photocopied he liked to say Muscle and Fiction magazine. Like he'd always say that. It always crack us up. Like, you photocopy that and then you go to the gym and like, boom, that's your workout. Like, yeah, maybe that's good one time, or maybe that's good for, 4 weeks. And then after that, you're going to be whatever. So it's like it's super helpful to understand both the in the trenches knowledge. Like, you have to know, like, what can people do, what's going to work, what's effective, and then understand, like, is this a good way of measuring that?
So you kind of opened the door to two related things. As you try to run a controlled study, which is the goal of much research, I want to go in the lab and control everything. Sometimes you end up with training programs that are not even realistic. So I want to compare this versus that, and let's equate for volume. Well, how are you calculating volume? Are you counting reps, or are you actually calculating joules of work, which means you better be measuring the forces and the distances? Are you talking about mean power or velocity? How are you defining volume? Okay, that's one issue. But then, so now I equate these two things, and because I'm making equal volume, I've got one of the programs it's literally a whacked out program. It's like, nobody even does this. Now, from a research standpoint, it was done to try to isolate a particular variable in the training program. And I'm using the weight room as an example. But, there's so many variables in a weight training program. You can talk about just a single training session. You have which exercises and what loads and what rest intervals and what how many reps or the volumes and the orders in which you do it. And then now let's start putting multiple workouts together, and you get into what model of periodization or non-periodization, or just and of which there are literally, if you do the math, you almost have an infinite number of ways to do it. So if I try to control one variable, like controlling volume, it will absolutely affect other variables. So you end up doing some kind of crazy programs, and it's like, okay, I see why they controlled this variable, but they ended up using such light weights. It's ridiculous. No one goes in the weight room and does it with healthy people, and especially with athletes. Okay. Or they say, well, it's too heavy. Well, what do you mean it's too heavy? It's still less than 100%. They were able to do it. So there's that issue, making sure that you actually end up with a realistic protocol you're following. The other is, who are your subjects? And a huge percentage of the studies are done with untrained people. And I've been involved with tons of those studies as well, because, for example, some of the early work we did on fiber adaptations and protein expression with strength training I did in Bob Stern's lab. And we purposely went for untrained people because we weren't sure what we'd see. Let's set the stage to see if there's an adaptation. We'll find it with these folks. But at some point, you have to realize with untrained people, you can do almost anything. You could have the worst training program out there. In fact, we laugh. Someday we're going to do this. Maybe before I retire, we're going to hire a construction company, bring their dump truck onto our property and dump a pile of rocks. And we'll give everyone work gloves and industrial belt, it's a weight belt, and steel-toed shoes, and we're going to lift rocks in a field. And if I have beginners, I'll bet my beginners make tremendous gains. Today, what are we going to do? Move the pile over there. Tomorrow, bring it back, whatever. But, and that's why you can work with beginners, or, if I'm a high school coach, what a fertile group of athletes or students or people to work with, because you can do almost anything and they will make huge gains. So now, does that apply to your elite runners? You got people that have been out there training for 8 years or 10. They're not beginners. And is that the right, and people will extrapolate findings from beginners or from disease populations. And it's like, no, these aren't even real programs for for someone that's more advanced, or the studies are not long enough. So I do, I'm working on a paper right now, and I'm looking at training studies that last 4 weeks. They're trying to look at muscle growth. It's like 4 weeks. Are you kidding me? 6 weeks, 8 weeks? And there's plenty of examples. Well, I shouldn't say there's not enough examples of long-term training programs. I love this one study that went for 9 months. And for the first half of the study, it was comparing 2 training programs, and everyone was making the same gains. Then there was a point in the middle where one group kind of leveled off, and the other group continued to make gains, not as rapidly. Gains come slower with more advanced people, and so you have to look, who are you training? And everyone likes to call their subjects highly trained. Well, what's highly trained? Or they call them, we studied elite athletes. Well, you were pretty good at your school or whatever, but what's elite? Some people say you need to be top 10 in the world. Well, good luck tracking those folks down. And then if you do, and this is an issue that national training centers have to deal with, they get criticized if they try to publish their research because you don't have an adequate sample size. Well, because there aren't that many people, and you don't have a control group. Who's going to be a control group for, so in the sports world, there are limitations that you have to live with, and yet these are the people that you're actually training, and so yeah, there's not a perfect design on any of that, but who the subjects are, what's the training program, and is it even a realistic program?
That reminded me of something that Dan John said. He's a very well-known strength coach, and he says, especially when it comes to something novel, something brand new, or to someone who's never trained before, like everything works for 6 weeks. But then what, right? Like, what do you do then? Like, you have to know how to program, because like the whole idea is so many strength coaches go to these conferences, like a yearly conference or a clinic, and then somebody who's on the cutting edge comes up, or a company that comes up with this brand new piece of equipment. They're like, hey, you've got to work this in, or you've got to try this. And it's like, I'm guilty of it. I'd go home, and if the conference is on a Friday or Saturday, guess what my clients were doing on Monday? Like what I just learned. And yeah, they'd see some pretty significant results. And then, 4 weeks later, it's like, I don't know what to do next. I don't know how to progress this, or it was just something different. So yeah, they were having, a decent result because of that. But I didn't understand the research behind it. I didn't understand what I was doing. And so I think there's a lot of that in the industry itself, and with the layman, like they have no idea what's going on most of the time. So
no, I agree with you.
So this is a tough one for a lot of people. It took me a while to understand it. What the hell is a null hypothesis? And I say what the hell because it's a funny story. In grad school, we had, statistics, and on our final, we had to, based off a certain amount of data and all this stuff, we had to then at the very bottom determine whether we would accept or not accept the null. And I was so over statistics at that point, and I wrote that I would reject the hell out of that null. And actually, I got a laugh out of the professor, and got a decent grade. But what is a null hypothesis? Because I think there's so many people who have no idea what that even means.
Well, we'll go back to the beginning of our discussion where we talked about the research question. So you've got a question that you're trying to get an answer to, or a partial answer to, or at least some insight on. And you have a hypothesis. What do you think will happen? I think that if I take this supplement, well, how about a pre-workout supplement? We did some stuff a few years ago on something that was just laced with tons of caffeine and a lot of other things, but it cranked you up pretty seriously. So, well, we have, based on what we know about pre-workout drinks, based on what we know about caffeine, but it wasn't just caffeine. Anyways, we have reason to think that, muscle contractility may be enhanced. As we were looking at that case, maybe it was too much too, because you can, there's optimal arousal and optimal, you don't want the jitters, and that's not a scientific term, but
you can redline the nervous system into not being able to do a very good job of sending signals.
But we had reason to say, okay, we think that the training sessions will be enhanced, and then the question was, will that lead to bigger chronic gains over, I forget if it was an 8-week or 10-week training period? Because in theory, okay, I have a good session, but is that going to lead to where at the end of several month training block, I actually am a little bit ahead? Mm-hmm. So then our theory, so then you come up with, the hypothesis we had, let's say, is that this one group that got the real thing versus a placebo, that they will, they'll be a little stronger at the end. Everyone should be increasing because they're all doing a supervised training program. I'll sneak this one in. Look carefully to see if the training in the studies was supervised or not. Or did they just send people off to their fitness center and have the person who hands out towels at the front door sign a sheet that, oh yeah, Andy did his workout. And there are studies that do that. They just send them out, or it's self-report, and it's like, okay. And because I have actually, in our lab, we at times do muscle biopsies. And I was working with a colleague once on a study, and we're getting ready to do the final biopsy. And I said, so how's your training gone? And they said, well, I kind of, upper body was good, but I kind of skipped on the lower body stuff. And I'm getting ready to do a biopsy on their lower body. Uh-huh. Well, that's interesting to know. I mean, we analyzed it, but that had to be part of our conclusion, and we had to weave that into it. It's like, compliance with the training program wasn't there, or a supplement study where I'll give you your case of supplement, and then you find out that they're selling it, because that makes pretty good money. So what controls are being put in place to avoid that? Because it's always going to be a challenge. Even I've been involved with studies where we had to make sure people took their supplement. Mm-hmm. And it's like, we're giving you free branched chain amino acids. Why would you? Well, we found out later that some were spitting them out. And so we had to look under their tongue. You felt like you were in a movie checking to make sure, at a psychiatric ward, are you taking your meds? Because they didn't want to they didn't want to gain too much weight and get out of their weight class. It's like, well, don't worry. This is not that good.
Not a lot of calories there.
Yeah. And, but what controls are there that are put in place to make sure that what you're trying to do is actually happening? Mm-hmm. But, so, you've got, I was trying to remember where I was going with this, because these are all important issues, but, the null hypothesis. Our hypothesis was that taking the pre-workout will enhance strength. The null hypothesis is there's no difference. Null, zero, not there. And so your statistics actually tell you, I got the results for this group, I got the results for this group, and they both came out about the same. And so you did not reject the null hypothesis. Now, my research hypothesis is this group's going to be better. Mm-hmm. Okay. And to support that, you reject the null. So we analyze it, and it's like, oh, they aren't the same. So mm-hmm. You're rejecting the null, but it's a, most research articles don't say this is the null hypothesis. They just report our hypothesis is that this will or will not have an effect. So But the statistical tools allow you to either accept or reject. In this case, in my example, yes, there was no difference, or yeah, there is a difference, which means I'm rejecting it. So it gets confusing because it's like kind of working at it from the other direction, and yet statisticians, they're like, yeah. They're all over that. So,
so you're basically, you have an idea ahead of time, like, yeah, I think this is going to work, but in order to limit as much of your own personal bias as possible, you're using this statistical method that says, you know what, between these two groups, there's going to be no difference. And then you run the statistical analysis and there is a difference. Then you can say, okay, well, the idea was there was no difference, but actually the stats show there is a difference. Therefore, there is evidence that this thing actually works.
You know, you remember the old movie Jerry Maguire? It's Tom Cruise and Cuba Gooding Jr. And Cuba Gooding Jr. says, "Show me the money. Show me the money." Well, this is where, if you're the person that's trying to decide, should I take this supplement in our example, show me the data. Because right now, I have no reason to think I should take this pre-workout supplement. I'm operating off the null hypothesis. These are both the same. But show me the data that, let's reject that. There is a difference, at least within the scope of this study, for these subjects doing this protocol, taking this supplement, this dosage, etc. Different subjects, maybe not. Different training programs, maybe not. So, and just because it's good for that group doesn't mean it's good for everyone. Now, I'm not a creatine expert, but that's a great example. There are some athletes that don't want to take creatine because sometimes people do put on a few pounds of fluid retention. Okay. Now, I thoroughly believe creatine very effective training modality, but I understand there's some athletes say, I don't want to carry that extra 3, 4, 5 pounds. And for their sport, it's not worth it to them. I'm like, well, that was interesting to me. That was kind of an eye opener. As a researcher, I'm like, sure, you'd want to take it. But for the practitioner, the people actually out there in the trenches, there's a rationale which was very real for them.
That's a tough one.
Happened to be sprinters, I guess. And I was like, really? But they're like, I just assume not carry that extra 5 pounds if it's fluid weight.
In the world of distance running especially, but track and field in general, for some reason a lot of people are averse to that, and I'm coming from the perspective that, like, maybe you have a few extra pounds, but it's intracellular, which means there's more pressure within the cell, which means you can exert more force per contraction. You're better at thermoregulation. Let's say you're a distance runner or a triathlete, like, maybe that's a good thing. And if you're training with it consistently, your body's going to figure out how to normalize that weight, whether the body wants to be as efficient as possible. And if it recognizes over time that it's more efficient with 3 extra pounds of intracellular water, then it's going to keep it. And if it recognizes, you know what, this is a bad thing, then it's probably going to get rid of that. So I always try to play devil's advocate when it comes to creatine for endurance athletes, because I think it's amazing. I think the benefits far outweigh that specific, risk to performance. But in a sport where the assumption is the lighter you are, the faster you'll be, it can be an uphill battle trying to get somebody to just, give it a try. Like, but it's going to reduce muscle damage. Maybe that's a good thing for recovery. Maybe you'll be able to accumulate more volume running, maybe. And then, I try to list off all these things like, well, it's also, good for this and it's good for that. And you increase satellite cell activation and proliferation, and that's going to be good for all these other things. And, it's just like, but I'm going to gain weight. It's like, okay, all right. You know what? If you don't want it, then you don't want it. So it's more for me.
Which is a big thing. If you have buy-in, that's huge. And, I'm getting into my wife's area, the sports psychology, but the confidence, the buy-in to the program, the coach and athlete interactions. And so, but if you have the confidence, that will take you so far. And I love, I'm a physiologist and we do biomechanical stuff. And that's all important. But even if I don't have that, but and we've all seen the athlete that just, I fully expect to do well. And it's like, that'll take you a long ways. Now, certainly you may not, I don't know. I'm sure there's a limit to that, but the confident person, a lot to be said for that.
That's for sure. So let's go into some of the more common errors that either in research methods or in the statistical methods that especially in the realm of sport performance or hypertrophy or strength and conditioning research that are unfortunately probably a little more common than they should be. And a lot of times it's labeled Broscience, let's say. So
let me start with Broscience.
Sure. Perfect.
I'm looking at my notes here, and it's, and I'll tie this in a little bit with social media. Social media, everyone's an expert because I have a platform out there and I can say whatever I want, and I have freedom of speech and so forth. And that's true. And how do you interpret that? And how do I even know who these people are? Do they have a clue and so forth? And my perception is, and I'm sure you'll have listeners that know more on top of it than I am, but there's some whacked out ideas floating around. There's extreme confidence that, look, I know the answer, just listen to me. Okay. But that also exists on the academic side. There's plenty, and I'll throw myself in there, lots of big egos, myself included. And I wish people would just understand it because I got it figured out. Well, I think it requires, understanding the research and being able to apply it requires a certain amount of modesty and humility. And that's easy for some folks and really challenging for others. Because how many followers do I have? That must mean I know I must be pretty knowledgeable because look, that says, oh, well, so don't get caught up in that. Maybe it's good, maybe not. So anyone and their cousin can come up with an idea and so forth. But one side says, okay, you have to put your filter on sometimes. However, you can't just throw that all out. And I would say so much of what we do in our athletic performance lab is highly dependent on our communication with the coaches and the athletes. Because I would say, I don't have any data, but probably a majority of our projects that we do in our lab are not because myself or my grad students or my colleagues come up with an idea. We're getting these ideas from the coaches and the athletes and the people that are in the trenches, and someone went out and they tried something. Now, is there any data to support it? No, but we've had some success, so we're going to incorporate it. And so then the sports scientist gets criticized that we're too slow. Well, doing good research is not fast. That takes a while. By the time we figure something out, well, the people in the trenches have moved on. Okay. So it's easy for a non-researcher to say, you guys are too slow. We don't have time for sports science. You guys are too slow. On the other hand, and there's some truth to that. On the other hand, how do you know what your methods are they any good? Because you're taking 10 different supplements and you're experimenting with 6 different training methods and you're bouncing all over, so what's going on? So on one hand, I think it's important for someone in sports science to be attuned to what for lack of better words, what Broscience is saying, because maybe there's some validity to it. And then you find out, okay, yeah, or maybe in certain circumstances, or here's a training method that seems to work, or it doesn't. Let's not waste our time. It's all voodoo, or someone's just trying to make money. If you go into the history If you ever get a chance, he's passed away, Dr. Terry Todd from the University of Texas, and his wife Jan, who also teaches there. They have a tremendous archive of strength and conditioning research, the weight training, weightlifting world. And if you ever read any of the stuff, it's fascinating on, what were the motivations of people to say like lifting would make you slow and sluggish. Mm-hmm. And you're going back a century or more, and sometimes it was to make money. Mm-hmm. That's still an issue. I go on the internet, and a lot of people trying to make money. I'm going to sell you this training device or my training program, and guaranteed. And it's like, maybe it is true, maybe not. But you still have to listen to it. So, I mean, you kind of walk in that line there of, you want that information, but mm-hmm. you also have to decide, okay, is there any legitimacy to it? And that's hard.
Take some work evaluating claims. So when we had talked before, we were able to cover just in passing a couple of the specific types of errors that can occur in research, and most of them I was completely unaware of. So if you could give us a little bit of an explanation about some of these, this would be great. So what is salami slicing?
Yeah, I'm just circling a few of these terms on my list, and that's one of where is my salami slicing thing? Well, that's not necessarily an error, but salami slicing is where you, another word that's sometimes used is you milk publications off your data set. Mm-hmm. So I do a big project, and there was in my opinion, there was a day and time where when you did a project and you published it all, and you go back in some of the early literature, the 40s, 50s, 60s, these were long manuscripts, and they covered a lot of data because everything that you did went in there. Mm-hmm. Well, in my opinion, one of the things that leads to what we call salami slicing is academics are rewarded by numbers of publications. Hey, I had 10 pubs this last year. Hey, I had 15. Hey, I had 20. There are things called impact factors and age factors and different ways of, well, how important is your research? How many times was it cited by someone? We'll come to mm-hmm. citations here in a second, but did someone else reference your work? If I do cancer research, I'm publishing in some heavy, hard-hitting, heavy-duty medical journals that have monstrous impact factors because mm-hmm. of the nature of their topic. In the exercise sports science world, the numbers are a lot smaller. And in some subdisciplines, they're extremely small because it's a very specialized community. So impact factors were not designed to determine the quality of the research. They were designed just to have an indication of who, how much is what's getting out there. Is it having, an impact? But unfortunately, it's like you're a good researcher because you had a lot of pubs and you have a lot of research dollars. And I'm not as good a researcher because I had half as many. Mm-hmm. And as opposed to, well, what is your research? What's it saying? So salami slicing, I can say, well, I'm going to take this piece of the data and I'm going to put it in this article. And then I'll take this piece of the data that's sort of related, but not exactly, and I'll make another article. And I'll take this piece and put it there, this piece, put it there and there. And there's actually documented cases. There's one that's kind of well known where someone got 30-some publications off the same data set and he went to different journals and so on. It's like, now that's an extreme. Wow. But if you're not paying attention, you can cite, there's over 30 papers that support this. No, it was coming off the same data set. Now, having said all that, it is absolutely appropriate to have a big study and say, and I have done this and others too, where, okay, we have some, maybe some hormonal data that is a big body of literature, and this part of the study will talk about the endocrine response. Mm-hmm. And here is our performance stuff that is related, but we've got tons of, and so there are cases where you can legitimately say, look, we're separating it out. We're telling the reader that we're separating it out, as opposed to we're just slicing this up into little salami slices. And if you look closely at some authors, in my opinion, there's no way that they did as many studies as they did within a certain window of time, and yet they have this monstrous number of publications. And then you go back and look, and it's like you have to really read the methods carefully. This has got to be the same study, and this one's the same study, and this one is men, and this one's women, and this one's kids, and this one's something else, and this one, and so but then they cite. So that's salami slicing, which brings up ethics and research. What's appropriate? And there's not a number. It's not like this is good, this is bad. But self-citations. Now I get to cite myself. So I cite this one and that one and that one and that one, and look, there's this many studies that support it. Yeah, there's only one project that actually. And so that means the reader has to go back and look at the references. And most people don't. And most reviewers don't. You say, well, it's in a scientific journal. Most don't go back and look at every single one to make sure that, okay, this is just saying the same thing. Same thing too, there's some authors that are notorious for writing reviews. Let's have a topic and I write a review, and next year I'm going to write another review on the same topic in a different journal. And in 10 months, I'm going to write another review on the same topic in another journal. And again, and again, and again, and again. And then I can cite 6 places that say the same thing. It's the same people saying the same thing. And is it really an issue, or did they make it one? And in my opinion, there are articles, there are papers out there that will say, some of their leading statements are, such and such is a controversial area. So they're setting the stage. And I'm reading it and I'm like, I've never heard of this controversy. Now, I don't know everything. But it's like, I don't think this is controversial. But you set the stage for the reviewer and the reader saying, oh, I guess it is controversial. Well, maybe someone did say it, but cite where that's a controversy. And what they're doing is they're making a controversy.
Kind of leading the witness.
Yes. And so then it's like, I don't think, now this is my opinion. There was a controversy cited sometime recently that there's a controversy that in aerobic cardiovascular endurance training leads to muscle hypertrophy. And I'm like, really? I've never heard that. But the whole thing was written on that. And I'm like, I've never, now, I don't know, you're a distance person and so forth. I'm not sure that you've ever worried about your on the track or on the course training being a problem for putting on too much mass. In fact, it's probably the opposite because it's such a catabolic activity. Yep. And so, I pick on that and not to, I'm not trying to call anyone out, but it's like, is this really a controversy, or let's just is it another publication? Let's get a few reviews out there. And so
I don't mean to cut you off, but I've seen some of that data and those studies that show like endurance running increased gastrocnemius cross-sectional area. It's like someone who's never run before, and it was like a 4-week study because it doesn't happen. Like, it's just like, and people who try to cite it like, oh, I don't need to lift weights if I'm a distance runner because my muscles are going to get bigger just from running. And I'm like, let's take a measuring tape and let's measure your calves right now. Let's measure your quads right now. Like, they're the same as your wrists and your forearms. Like, this is not good, man. Like, you should probably do some lifting here. But yeah, I've seen that stuff, but kind of alluding back to what we talked about before, like, what's the length of the study? Who are the subjects? Like, you're picking people who anything's going to work for 6 weeks. Like, you give them a brand new stimulus, yeah, their body's going to respond by becoming more efficient, and the immediate response for the body to become more efficient is to improve the quality and function of those muscles. And in the short term, that meant they were going to get bigger. But
and related to that is there is a ton and arguably much more research out there that deals with rehab and therapy and activities of daily living and general health and fitness, where that's absolutely appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm a physical therapist and I know that this is very real. I'll have a patient who now has been either in a cast or has been immobile, and
Mm-hmm.
now they have atrophy of the gastrocnemius, or the triceps surae muscles, and absolutely. So you start being locomotive now, and there will be hypertrophy because you've gone from one level of activity to something new.
Mm-hmm.
Can I take that and apply that to my cross-country team? No, because it's now, is that helpful to know? Sure. Is that, though, going to change the program you're writing for your athletes? Probably not, because you know what the training stimulus is and the population is and the purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you come back to understanding, the stimulus. And one other thing, you got me on a roll here, but one thing too is I love reviews, because when they're well done, they can pull together so much information, and they don't just sit there and say, here was study 1 and they saw this, here was study 2 and they saw that, here was study 3. I can go print off a stack and I can, go through that. What I love is when let's synthesize this.
Mm-hmm.
So what does this mean? We're seeing this, and this data suggests this, and they try to, weave the story. And so those can be so helpful. And one method, some things that are emerging now, they've been around for many years. Very effective ways of doing reviews are meta-analyses and what are called systematic reviews.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've read things where they say these are much more valid reviews because you don't bring your bias in. You're not skipping important literature just to only talk about the research that supports your idea.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, if you write a good review, you should present everything, not just cherry pick the stuff that supports your idea.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't do that, then that, in my opinion, is an error as a writer of one of those. So in theory, I do a systematic review. I go in and I look for certain terms, and anyone who's done a term paper for class, you go to one of the search engines, you type in the keywords, and I get all kinds of research. But everyone who's done that knows what words I type in is going to really change what I get.
Mm-hmm.
So these systematic analysis reviews and meta-analyses are only as good as the terms that you use to search.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not unusual that you find that there's quite a bit of the literature that was left out because they just look for a handful of words and they get all these results, but then they weed out ones that are not closely related. But in my experience, you also miss some stuff that is out there. And so then, for example, I'm involved in working on a paper where there's a meta-analysis out there that has 8 papers. Now, first of all, if you're doing a meta-analysis, that's not very many.
Mm-hmm.
You might as well just write a regular review. You don't need a meta-analysis if there's only 8 valid papers. At my last count, we're up to over 100 references that are relevant to the topic, but they didn't have the right keywords. And it's kind of like, I think it's very easy to miss it because it becomes so mechanized. And so, I put in these words, this is what we got, and we see the number and it went up, and so it has an effect, as opposed to, well, let's sit down and kind of think this thing through a little bit. Now, that being said, meta-analyses, systematic reviews are tremendous tools. but the reader has to also look carefully. Is it a meta-analysis that doesn't have very many out there, or is it as thorough and complete as it could be? And they're a lot of work, but but it's you have to ultimately be the person that reads it and decides, okay, where do I put this on my scale of is it thorough enough, and is it helpful information, and where does it fit in? And so it's just something that the reader has to be aware of. It's easy to say, well, a meta-analysis gives you a final number, good, bad, and it's like, well, it may not be that simple.
Gotcha. So let's talk a little bit about the manner or the specific journal of publication. How does that fit into the, let's say, the weight or quality of a study?
Yeah. You know, there are journals that are highly respected, high impact. You know, sometimes journals have very specific niche in the scientific literature where they really have a specialized focus. Some are much more general, some are very specialized. And so that is, that's something to consider. And every journal has available somewhere, and I don't know if it's available publicly or not. I'm on editorial board for some journals, and so as a reviewer and editor, I get to see the data where, okay, what is our acceptance rate? So we have X number of articles that get submitted, and your very prestigious journals have very low acceptance rates, which is kind of discouraging as a researcher. So you reject 90% of what gets submitted. So there may be some really good stuff out there, but I can't get it into this journal. But there's tiers at different levels. I heard an interesting talk a while back from 3 Nobel laureates, and one of them was I forget his name, Peter someone. He was worked at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis when I lived there. So, but he was giving an interview with 2 other Nobel winners. So these guys are, they don't have to prove themselves to anyone on anything. And they were talking about their recommendation to researchers was, don't worry as much about where you go with your publication, get it out there. He says so many people, I'm going to try to go here and it gets rejected, or the reviewers want changes made, so you make some changes, but then you end up having to go to a different journal, and it may take forever to get it out, and your wheels are spinning, and then sometimes you end up with a final product not really what you wanted. Is, they're saying just get it out there so it can be cited. Now, if you've won a Nobel Prize, you could look at them and say, well, you've won a Nobel Prize, you can go publish wherever you want. Where if I'm a young faculty member, I need to establish myself and I need to go to a good place. And in some places, as a researcher, you're rewarded for going to higher tier journals. So there's that to be considered. There are also journals, and I'm going to put some of this as my opinion. There are a ton of journals because every single day, and I'm not the only one, I get tons of emails. Dear Dr. Blank, they don't even know who I am. We read your article and it's on something, and we want you to publish in our journal, most esteemed person, so on. And so there are a ton of new journals out there. They are all over the place. They have no idea what I do. They just want an article, and they have page charges. So they're for-profit entity. And I don't know what the publication rate or the acceptance rate is for these journals, because I have personally talked to people that said they submitted it and it immediately got accepted and it was out.
Wow.
Because when they sent the money. Bing. So is it really reviewed, and who's reviewing it? And sometimes you'll read some articles that this article shouldn't even be at this journal. This has nothing to do with what the title of the journal is about, but they're going there and it will get out there. Mm-hmm. It'll get published. So then it's like, what's the quality of the research and what's the quality of the review? Mm-hmm. Now, I'll give an example. This week, I actually got asked to review an article, and no one that will listen to this will have any involvement, because it was about new sensors, development of a new sensor for braking torque in automobiles. So this is an automotive engineering technology thing. I got asked for that. I'm like, what am I doing? Why did they even ask me? Mm-hmm. Somewhere they got on, and it's like, it makes no sense. Yeah. And, and yet I'm being asked to do it. So if I say, yeah, and I say, great, go ahead and publish it. That's not a valid review because I don't know the topic. Mm-hmm. And I have a feeling that there are, in my opinion, there are journals that if I'm willing to pay, it will get in. And some of them are very prominent, very highly visible. Mm-hmm. But it's also then when you go back, and this gets to another issue, you go back and you carefully read what was done, read the methods. And this is laborious, but I'm not sure that the methods were really that appropriate. Mm-hmm. And and that's not just these journals, but what are the methods? Were the proper methods even used? And it's easy to kind of glaze through the methods real quick. It's like, yeah. But it's like, I'm not even sure that was appropriate or an appropriate interpretation. Mm-hmm. So it's, so it'd be easy to say peer review process is not very good. No, I don't buy that at all. Peer review process is good. And I'm not a fan of the non-peer review. Put it out there and let everyone else review it. Well, that means, my plumber could review it. Anyone that has an opinion can review it, whether they know anything or not. And that's problematic. Mm-hmm. And these are evolving challenges, but not every journal, some have really good reputations. And, I go down and I look at who's on the editorial board. Mm-hmm. Are these people who actually know the topic? Which is also, as you read research, what is this lab known for? Is this paper on something they're not even trained in this area? I look at their publication list, they're dabbling outside the area, which doesn't mean it's bad research, but my guard is up, the caution flag is up. Yeah. If you would, you should not be reading my articles on automotive sensors for braking. Because I know nothing, and yet, so I don't know. It's a conundrum coming and going.
For sure, that's hilarious. So to kind of sum everything up, because we're going a little over an hour now, hour 20 or so. How do you set up a research study to prevent most of these issues from becoming actual issues? Like, how do we better design the control into the study so that we limit bias and we limit any sort of issues with our conclusions?
Just a couple kind of closing thoughts. Designing a study, is the fundamentals of research design, which most students will take a class in. And you do your best to control as many extraneous factors as possible. I doubt that there's ever been a perfect study designed ever. Mm-hmm. So there will be limitations. Your goal is to have them, to recognize the limitations of them. So you interpret it accordingly, and to minimize, the number and the size or the magnitude of the limitation. And then realize that your study is only going to, your results apply within the scope of the study. If I'm looking at untrained people, then my results apply to that population. Now, might I be able to extrapolate it to an athletic population, for example? You might, but there's that caution flag. It's like we don't know. So, you try to minimize the number of limitations, and hopefully there's no fatal flaw. And you recognize and acknowledge the ones that are there. And maybe you don't support your research hypothesis. That's okay. And, that's an area that people have brought up that, you didn't have any statistically significant results. Well, that's still important to know. And it's not exciting necessarily. I mean, it could be, but it's like, I didn't discover anything new. It's kind of like, no, this was a bust. No, it's not a bust. It means I'm not going to spin my wheels and waste my time going down this direction further. Or I need to redesign my study and control for something I wasn't able to before. I think another thing in summary is it's easy to oversimplify. We did a study. We saw no effect. This doesn't work. And there are plenty of examples out there where people say there's no relationship between muscle size and strength. And they cite a study. And it's like, well, I can cite some of my work that saw increased strength but no change in muscle size. That doesn't mean that there's no relation. It's kind of like black or white, yes or no, up or down, good or bad. It's not like that. It'd be like saying, this is the training program you should have your athletes use, not this one. Good, bad. Well, it's usually not that simple. And so we're complex systems. So it's, you have to understand that it's multifaceted. We can get a little bit of insight, but people love to oversimplify. And everyone likes to be critical. Everyone's an armchair quarterback. Why didn't they call this play in the Super Bowl? Well, same thing. Your research is terrible because I can be critical of this and this and this. And it's like, fine. So how is your research on that topic? And well, we don't do research on the topic. It's like, okay. And there's plenty of that too. So it's kind of like, maybe that's a legitimate critique, but I want to see where, okay, how are you fixing it? If you're an expert on that, then obviously you must be doing something in this area. Now I'm oversimplifying this too, but it's real easy to be critical, and I'm as guilty of it as the next. But there are some people, if you look down their publication list, that's all they do: letters to the editor and critiques of you're wrong and you're wrong and you're wrong and you're wrong. And it's like, well, they bring up some good points sometimes, but yeah, it's hard it makes it challenging to read and interpret.
Yeah, if there's no room for nuance, then it's probably a whole lot harder to actually progress. And the thing about nuance is that it takes time and that it takes energy, and you gotta figure out what the data actually says, and that's time consuming and can require some blood, sweat, and tears.
Well, and I don't want anyone, if anyone's listened this far, I don't want them to I don't want the take-home message to be like, wow, this is a mess out there. But the take-home message should be, you really have to remember that you do know exercise. And you should know programming and periodization or training programs or proper sport technique or proper exercise methods, and how do I properly evaluate it? What are the types of tests and so forth? And lots of times you have to read it carefully. You can't just look at the title, and you can't just read the abstract. Now that's the first step, but you really, okay, there's more to it than that. And maybe, I subscribe to some online services that provide research information. They kind of synthesize, but I still have to kind of look and say, okay, are they on? Do I agree with their evaluation or not? And so Yeah.
There's a lot of abstract experts on
Yes.
Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and it's a lot of people make a lot of money talking about abstracts, and then but they have not read the study. They're just looking at a tiny bit, a snapshot, a thumbnail of everything that's available.
The challenge for the sports scientist is to effectively communicate, and that doesn't happen enough. I think because I mean, it's hard to wear multiple hats, but in the sport and exercise science world, you have to be able to bridge that gap. You have to be able to talk to the coach and the trainer, and the therapist, but I also have to be able to talk to the biologist or the physiologist or the chemist and the biomechanist. Have to be, and so when that's done, that can be really cool.
For sure. Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because my entire goal of doing this podcast was to communicate with as many people in all the various aspects of sport performance and rehab and nutrition and research, and I'm not an expert in all of those things. I wish I could be, but it's physically impossible. It's mentally impossible. But if I have these networks and these connections and rapport with people who are experts in all of those areas, then it's a whole lot easier for me to answer questions that I have, so that I can be as effective as possible with my clients and with my athletes. If there's something I don't know, sometimes I don't even know where to begin to look, but I might know somebody who's, who deals with that on a daily basis. And, the better we are at, like you said, communicating not only the message, but communicating with other people within the industry, the better off everyone is. So,
yeah.
So how can people follow you? How can people stay up to date on the work that you're doing and the research that you're publishing?
Well, one, you can certainly go to like PubMed or Sport Discus and, look for AC Fry. That's Fry, no E. As simple a name as it is, I have to spell it. But so you can see my the peer-reviewed publications. My lab, the Jayhawk Athletic Performance Lab, has a Twitter and a Facebook and Instagram sites, and I should have them in front of me, but because they're all slightly different. But it's but if you find it, we try to post something every couple times a week, and we're in the process of developing our advisory board, which is not sports scientists, it's coaches. We want people that are going to hold our feet to the fire. And is this, are we doing projects and giving you helpful information because you guys are the coaches and the ones that have worked with these sports? And also we've gotten a lot of good ideas from people. So now we're in the process of, over the next few weeks, we'll be announcing the beginning of our advisory board. In fact, later today, I'll be posting our first member. So that's kind of exciting because we've got some good people, and some of them really know science. Some of them really know their sport and have over 40 years of experience.
Wow.
Who am I to argue with someone who has competed and just a whole career, almost half a century in their sport? Yeah, okay, I think you know what you're talking about. So
that's awesome. Well, I'll include Instagram and Twitter and Facebook stuff in the show description, so everybody can have access to that. Right. So I like to give all my guests just a way to kind of close things out. It can be related to the topic that we discussed. It can be completely unrelated. What is something that you think is extremely important or vital for everybody watching or listening to hear?
That's a great question, man. It's funny, something came right to mind. And my students have heard me say this, but our work with sport performance, if you're into sports and athletics, okay, it resonates with you. But there's a lot of people that are like, well, you could be doing work on a lot of different areas that can enhance health and fitness or diseases and so forth. I really am a strong advocate of from two perspectives. I think this is important. A person's experience in sport is something they'll take with them for their life. Mm-hmm. So is there some way, whether it's training methods or strategies, or and I'll throw what my wife does in the motivational environment that a coach or trainer or therapist or teacher or supervisor can create to enhance that experience, that is huge. I'd love for everyone to perform as well as possible, but know that they didn't look back and say, gee, I wish I had just known something different. Maybe I could have performed better. You'd love everyone to reach their potential. Another piece of that, though, too, is I think the analogy I like to use is the auto industry. So I drive my family van, or I've got a pickup truck that I haul things around in, and we've got a couple sedans and so forth. But you've got Formula One racers and NASCAR and dragsters and all these high performance vehicles that use cutting edge technology, and boy, can they perform. That technology will trickle down to the family van that I drive. So if we can take some of the things we learn about what about optimum high level performance, like athletes. It's not the only place that happens, but that's a great place. There will be technologies and methods and evaluations and tests and training and so forth and rehab methods that will trickle down to activities of daily living and, to the general population. Now, that takes a little while. It won't come directly from me, but it's part of the foundation. So I think that sometimes people fail to realize that, some of these things are going to be helpful, and it works the other way too. Sometimes it works the other way, but that's what's kind of fun about this whole field. Yeah,
no, I agree. It can be sometimes difficult to there's times where I feel like, am I making the most difference? Like I wanna think that I'm helping people, and it's like, I'm just helping. Sometimes I'm just helping kids play a sport. Like, what impact am I actually having? And then there's times where a kid that I worked with 10 years ago is like, hey, by the way, I'll run into them on the street, and they're like, hey, by the way, this one thing you said motivated me to do this, and it completely unrelated to sport. Maybe it was something that I said, about, prioritizing their academics, or just like showing an interest in them, making them feel worthwhile. I can have a huge impact on people. And sometimes assuming that, we're just working, on something as insignificant as sport, like, but sport is the universal language, and it connects everybody, the entire world. And we can have a huge impact on people's lives. So I think that's extremely important for everyone to remember. And Dr. Fry, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This has been extremely enlightening, really fun conversation. I appreciate your time, and I know everybody watching and listening has picked up a few nuggets of knowledge, so thank you again.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's fun talking shop.
Yes, it really is. Even stuff like statistics, which is, everybody knows, boring and stupid and worthless. But no, I joke. I hope to have you on again in the future, and we can discuss more fun things. And we'll cross that bridge down the road.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Awesome. All righty, y'all. Thanks for watching and listening. Stay tuned to next week. Stay tuned for our episode next week. All righty, y'all. Adios.